Welcome to the deep dive. So you look at the headlines, you look at the data, and the story around autism spectrum disorder, or ASD, it just looks like this unstoppable wave over the past few decades.
It really does seem that way from the outside.
Right. So today we're diving deep into that story to ask, well, a really fundamental question. Is ASD truly like exploding? Or are we just, finally getting better at actually seeing it?
That's the core tension, absolutely.
The scale of change is pretty staggering. If you go back to late 70s, estimates were tiny, maybe 0.2% prevalence. But since the 90s, wow.
It's been a steep climb.
Yeah, one UK study showed something like an 800% increase in diagnoses over just 20 years. 800%.
Importantly, that's not just a UK thing. It's happening globally. Here in the U.S., the CDC's 2022 numbers suggest about 1 in 31 8-year-olds. And in other places, like South Korea, one study found 2.6% prevalence. That's, more than 1 in 40 people.
That context is just crucial. So, okay, our mission today isn't just to be shocked by the numbers. We're going to unpack the actual sources, epidemiological studies, a really key big twin study from Sweden, some U.S. environmental research to figure out for you what's really driving this huge global shift.
And to do that, we really need to keep two possibilities in mind. Is the underlying condition itself, the actual symptom phenotype, becoming more common? Or are we just changing how we identify, label, and, diagnose it?
Right.
And the data, especially from those long-term studies, it strongly suggests the latter is doing most of the work here.
Okay, so let's start with maybe the first big clue, that this isn't all about newborns. We tend to think the surge is like toddlers getting diagnosed, right?
That's a common image, yeah.
But the data shows the biggest increase is actually in teenagers and adults, people who've been around a while without that label.
Exactly. That UK finding you mentioned, the average age at diagnosis actually went up.
Up? How much?
From 9.5 years old in 1998 to 14.5 in 2018.
Wow, 5 years later on average. So the system's playing catch up.
Precisely. We're finally identifying this large group of people who were missed before. The sort of lost generation of adults who didn't fit the old, narrower definitions.
And that includes groups where autism used to be seen as, pretty rare, right? Like women?
Definitely women, yes. And also individuals with what we might now see as milder symptoms. Clinicians, and the public too, are realizing autism looks very different across genders and cognitive abilities.
Okay, so if the people haven't fundamentally changed, but the diagnosis system has, what's driving that steep rise in the official counts? Is it just doctors being more aware?
Awareness is definitely a huge piece of it, but it's part of a bigger systemic shift. We see sort of three main factors that aren't about the underlying condition changing.
Okay, what are they?
First, the actual diagnostic criteria have broadened a lot.
How so?
Our sources confirm you need significantly fewer symptoms now to get an ASD diagnosis compared to, say, 20 or 30 years ago. You lower the bar, more people meet the criteria. Makes sense.
All right, easier to qualify. What's number two?
Second, that increased awareness you mentioned, public and professional, leads directly to more people being referred for assessment, which naturally means more diagnoses follow.
Okay, more referrals, more diagnoses. And the third?
And third, there's this really interesting phenomenon called diagnostic substitution.
Diagnostic substitution. That sounds a bit like shuffling paperwork. What does it mean in the real world?
It's basically about changing labels. Think about a child with social communication issues, maybe some rigidity, learning struggles. They always needed support, right?
Sure.
But before the ASD label became so prominent, maybe they were diagnosed with a learning disability or a speech disorder, maybe even just a behavioral issue. Diagnostic substitution is the idea backed by evidence that as ASD diagnoses go up, rates for other things, especially general learning disabilities, tend to go down.
Ah, okay. So the child's needs haven't necessarily changed.
Exactly.
But the label we use to categorize those needs we're swapping the file folder.
You got it. That's a good way to put it.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. But it leads us right to the core issue, the thing that really challenges this whole autism epidemic idea. If diagnoses are soaring, does that automatically mean more people are actually being born with autism?
Right. That's the million-dollar question.
And this is where that Swedish research you mentioned comes in, the twin study. Sounds critical.
It really is key evidence. It's called the Child and Adolescent Twin Study in Sweden, or CTs. They looked at a big group, kids born between 1993 and 2001. And here's the crucial part. They didn't just count diagnoses. They used the same parent questionnaires to measure autism symptoms across the whole population when the kids turned 18.
So they were measuring the traits themselves, not just the label.
Over time. Exactly, measuring the actual symptom phenotype.
And what did they find? Did the symptoms go up alongside the diagnoses?
This is the finding that really should shift the public conversation. Across those 9 birth years, they found no increase in the average parent-reported ASD symptom score.
No increase at all.
None. The level of traits in the general population, the social difficulties, the repetitive behaviors appears stable.
Wow. Okay, so stable symptoms, but skyrocketing diagnoses. How does that even work? That seems to directly contradict the idea of some new environmental factor causing a massive surge.
It really does. If there was some powerful new trigger causing an epidemic, you'd expect to see it in those population symptom scores.
Makes sense.
And interestingly, the same study did look at ADHD symptoms. There, they found a small, significant increase, but only in girls, not boys.
Huh.
The fact that the ASD scores stayed flat is probably the strongest piece of evidence we have that the epidemic is more about how we see autism, not about more autism existing.
So if the symptoms are stable, the driver must be how the world reacts to those symptoms, not the symptoms themselves.
That's the core mechanism, yes. It's about an increase in perceived dysfunction or impairment.
Perceived dysfunction.
Meaning, the study suggests that someone with a certain level of symptoms, say 10 years ago, might not have seemed impaired enough to get a diagnosis. But today, that exact same level of symptoms is now seen as causing more significant problems, leading to a diagnosis.
Why? Why would the same traits be seen as more impairing now?
Well, think about societal demands. Our world, especially in schools and workplaces, demands much more complex social communication and executive function skills than it used to.
Right. Things are faster, more complex, more socially demanding.
Exactly. So skills related to flexibility, understanding social nuance, planning, they're more critical. A trait that might have been manageable, even quirky, back in, say, 1985, might genuinely be more disabling in today's environment.
So the environment changes the impact of the trait.
Precisely. Plus, there's the practical side. Often, getting a formal diagnosis is the only way to unlock access to needed support and resources, which can be expensive. That creates an incentive, too.
Okay, here's another angle that seems to back this up. The idea that we're catching up, not chasing an epidemic. Let's look at who is getting diagnosed now, geographically and socioeconomically, because that picture is totally flipped, right?
It really has, and it tells a powerful story about identification. Globally, if you look at where ASD prevalence and disability seem highest, it's concentrated in high sociodemographic index countries, basically, wealthier nations.
Right, Japan.
Japan is a perfect example. They have one of the highest reported rates. But it's not likely because there's biologically more autism there. It's because they have sophisticated diagnostics, high awareness, good systems for tracking cases.
And the flip side.
Conversely, in low SDI countries, places like Timor-Leste, the reported rates are artificially low. Not because autism isn't there, but because the healthcare infrastructure, the trained professionals, the reporting systems, they're just not developed enough to find and count it. The light hasn't reached everywhere yet.
And we're seeing a similar story about equity playing out right here in the U.S., aren't we? The latest CDC data showed a major shift in terms of race and ethnicity.
Yes, this is a huge development from the 2022 data. It completely reverses the historical pattern we saw before, about 2016, where prevalence seemed higher in white children.
So what's the picture now?
Now, prevalence is actually statistically higher among Asian or Pacific Islander, Black, and Hispanic children compared to white children.
Higher, wow.
Yeah, the old idea that autism was mostly a disorder of white middle-class kids, that was likely just an artifact of who had better access to diagnosis. Now we're seeing rates like 38 per 1,000 for API kids, 36 per 1,000 for Black kids, compared to about 28 per 1,000 for white kids.
So the diagnosis is finally reaching communities where it was probably always present, but overlooked or misdiagnosed due to barriers.
Exactly. It's a sign of improving equity and identification, which is a positive thing.
But there's a complication there, isn't there? Something about co-occurring intellectual disability.
Yes, that's an important nuance. The data shows that Black, American, Indian Alaska Native, and API children diagnosed with ASD are more likely than white children with ASD to also have an intellectual disability diagnosis.
How much more likely?
For instance, over half of Black children with ASD also had co-occurring ID, compared to about a third of white children. This might suggest that differences linked to social determinants of health could be contributing to higher rates of significant disability in some groups, which in turn might lead to earlier, more obvious diagnoses that get captured more easily.
Right, the more severe cases get picked up first.
Hmm.
And what about the old idea linking autism to wealth, high socioeconomic status?
That seems to be fading too. The data used to suggest a link between higher ASD rates and wealthier neighborhoods, but that association is now generally gone.
Gone.
Mostly absent, yes. In fact, a few U.S. sites in the CDC network actually showed higher ASD prevalence linked with lower neighborhood income levels.
So the tide has really turned. It confirms autism cuts across all social and economic lines.
Absolutely. The condition itself doesn't discriminate based on class. Our ability to see it did for a long time.
Okay, let's tackle the last piece then. Even if the overall symptom rate isn't climbing dramatically, could environmental factors still be playing a role, maybe for people who are already susceptible? We looked at some U.S. research on air pollution during pregnancy.
Right. This is a study using the Big Echo cohort here in the U.S. They looked at prenatal exposure to common air pollutants, things like fine particles, PM2.5, nitrogen dioxide, NO2, and ozone, O3, and linked it to autism outcomes, both diagnoses and traits.
And what did they find? Especially since, pollution levels are often claimed to be below current standards.
Well, the most consistent finding was related to ozone, O3. Higher exposure during pregnancy was linked to higher scores on autism trait scales and also a higher likelihood of an ASD diagnosis.
Even below current air quality standards.
That's the really concerning part, yes. The association held even at ozone levels, generally considered safe by current U.S. standards.
How might that work?
The researchers suggest that ozone exposure, maybe especially in the first and third trimesters, could trigger inflammation or oxidative stress during pregnancy, and that might subtly alter neurodevelopment in babies who are already vulnerable.
Okay, that sounds like a potential environmental link. But how does that square with the big picture, finding that overall symptoms aren't rising in the population? Is there a catch?
There is a very important caveat, and it ties everything back together. When the researchers specifically removed participants who were already considered high risk, like babies born very prematurely or kids who already had an older sibling with autism, the link between those air pollutants, including ozone and ASD outcomes, mostly disappeared in the overall analysis.
So it's not necessarily causing autism across the board.
It strongly suggests not. It seems the impact of something like low-level ozone is likely strongest, or at least most detectable, in individuals who already have some underlying genetic or developmental susceptibility. The environment might act more like a modifier, maybe pushing someone who was already predisposed over the diagnostic threshold.
Got it. Not creating it from scratch, but perhaps influencing expression in vulnerable groups.
That seems to be the most plausible interpretation, fitting with the broader picture.
Okay. So, pulling all these threads together, what's the big takeaway?
Well, to synthesize what we've covered from these sources, the dramatic rise in ASD diagnoses isn't really reflecting a true epidemic of the underlying symptoms. Those seem pretty stable according to the best longitudinal data we have.
Right.
It's much more a story about society, about increased recognition, about diagnostic criteria that have broadened significantly, and importantly, about finally achieving more equitable identification across different sexes, races, and socioeconomic groups. We're essentially just getting a clearer picture of the true full prevalence that was always there, but hidden.
So the implication then, for you listening and for society, is that the challenge really shifts, doesn't it? We can stop debating whether the condition itself is suddenly spreading like wildfire.
Yeah.
The real challenge now is managing the consequences of this dramatic increase in diagnosed cases driven by those societal changes and better identification. We need to figure out how to make sure our healthcare, our schools, our social supports can actually meet the needs of this now much more visible population, which represents a consistent neurodevelopmental difference. It's about managing resources and ensuring access for a population we're finally seeing clearly, not fighting some mysterious, rapidly spreading new condition.
And that's a wrap on this episode of MedDecode. I really appreciate you joining me today. If something we talked about sparked your interest, or if there's a medical term that's been bugging you, let me know in the comments. And if you enjoyed this, be a pal and share it with a friend. We'll catch you on the next one.